And so I think there's, for me, being traditionally like sort of from the left end of the spectrum, climate science believing, Bitcoin, 100% Bitcoin person, but I'm really, really unlike, your typical Bitcoin maxi maybe, because a lot of my political views and my personal views are on the other side of the spectrum. But like we're like dead aligned on the role of money being the fundamental driver of the problems of society, the need for long-term time horizons for planning, and the impacts of money on both the well-being of our natural capital, the environment, and on our human capital and our communities and our families.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Murray Rudd to the podcast. Murray is an ex-academic specializing in environmental economics and policy research. He now serves as a science advisor for Satoshi Action, and he shares Bitcoin ideas and briefing notes at Bitcoin Distillery blog. Welcome to the Bitcoin Edge, Murray.
Thanks very much, Paula. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
Yes, I've been looking forward to chatting with you. I've been reading some of your blogs, and they're really amazing. But
Thank
before
you.
we get to all of that, tell us a little bit about how an ex-academic found Bitcoin.
Well, I actually found it before I was an ex-academic. I mean, I've been aware of it for a long time. My story is not super exciting. There was like no flash of lightning that sort of like led me to Bitcoin or anything like that. I'd seen it back in 2010, the Bitcoin faucet. I thought it was a scam and they were looking for my email address, not my Bitcoin address. So I didn't take advantage of the 5 free Bitcoin per day, it would have never lasted, I know. So that's okay. And then Bitcoin actually came up in in the environmental policy field back in about 2015. It was flagged in one of the Horizon scans that run in the environmental science field as a potential uh, um, tool for using waste energy consumption, and using waste energy actually had some implications for biodiversity conservation. I worked with a lot of people in the shipping industry. My academic background's mainly ocean related. So even though I focused on biodiversity, I worked with people in shipping, and they were very interested in blockchain technologies generally, just so they could track, shipping products and things like that. Bitcoin was on the radar screen. I tried to buy a couple of times back in like 2017, 2018, and I got sort of turned around by exchanges at that time. And the only way I would have had to buy was peer-to-peer networks with somebody from like St. Petersburg, Russia. And so I wasn't going to like send my money there. So it took a while, but like it had been a growing sense of awareness on Bitcoin. And then like a lot of people, I didn't really understand the difference when I did get into it. The first thing I bought was Bitcoin. We have Canadian ETFs that launched, so there was a bit of publication about or a bit of publicity about Bitcoin back in I guess that would be 5 or 6 years ago now. But I did do the altcoin thing as well until in 2021, like that just all blew up and or early 22. And so I went 100% Bitcoin, and like that's where I am right now.
So, what was it about Bitcoin that attracted you? Was
Fixed
it
I can answer that before you even finish the question.
great? Great.
Okay, fixed supply. So I'm a microeconomist, an applied microeconomist by training. So a lot of my training was in agricultural economics. In agricultural economics, especially here in Canada where I'm based, we have supply management. And supply management is something that is used, say, in the turkey industry, in the dairy industry, to curtail the amount of supply going onto markets. And anything with a fixed supply is of interest because that has the potential as demand goes up and the supply is fixed, it has potential for these amazing price appreciation trajectories. So that's why I was interested in Bitcoin. And that was flagged early on. That was a main focus for me.
Yeah. So, having fixed supply is a wonderful thing, but we still need the adoption and the interest.
Yeah, adoption and interest. So that's the demand side of it that needs to come along. And I mean, it certainly seems to be. It's been around for 16 years now, and ETFs, and institutional adoption, and the nation state level. And certainly from a market perspective, it makes it extremely interesting because the world's never seen anything with an absolutely fixed supply before. We've had different commodities that have fixed supply for certain time spans. I remember I was invested back in, I think it was 2007 or so, in some copper mines in Canada, and copper just went absolutely ballistic and did like a 20x. But of course, then after that, more mining properties came onto the online, and copper prices fell back down as demand curtailed again. So, yeah, supply and demand, that's what microeconomists do, is basically try to tease out supply and demand curves and the interactions and try to work out what happens under different scenarios in the future. What I didn't realize, so is that supply feature, the design of Bitcoin that attracted me originally. But what I had no idea about at that time was, of course, the energy implications, the environmental implications, and I say that on the positive side, not on the negative side, and also the lifestyle changes that something with a fixed supply can actually induce time preference changes. So in the microeconomics field, time preferences are also like really, really interesting because they have such an influence on what we can do in the future with our money and how we should invest. So there's all these things, and I think like most people, I've spent the last 3 years full time on Bitcoin working in the space, and I'm just constantly learning new things. And it seems to ripple out. And, the more you learn about it, the more questions it opens up. And the more questions you start to look at and address, then that leads off in other tangents. So it's really quite something I find to be engaged in the Bitcoin space at this time when things do look like they're taking off, when the technology is starting to become better understood, and when there's potential synergies now with different types of new technologies coming together in this world that's just going crazy with change.
Before we started, we were talking a little bit about the macro. And what's happening right now in the world is most people seem to be buying gold. And that really isn't a fixed supply, like you mentioned with copper. And so Bitcoin adoption is increasing. I don't know if we're at exponential yet, but it is increasing. And it is the only asset with fixed supply that does have good adoption. But it's interesting that people are buying gold.
Yeah, I mean, gold's familiar. I mean, gold is the traditional safe haven, so I don't think it's not surprising that people are buying gold. I think gold prices were suppressed for decades too, and now with the breakout of gold, once it started to break, it has probably quite a bit of room to move. There's a lot that goes on in the markets. I mean, there's the sort of the paper equivalents, just like we see in Bitcoin. I don't understand gold markets at all, but I don't find it surprising that when inflation is looming around the world and when there's financial uncertainty, it's natural for that people go to a store of value. And for many people, that's still gold, although it's becoming Bitcoin, hopefully more and more in the future.
Yeah. And as we know, Bitcoin is quite a learning curve for many people. So it takes that too. And on that note, did the economics that you learned ever touch on the true nature of money?
No. And as we talked before we started recording, microeconomics and macroeconomics are two completely different disciplines, really. And so for me, I have a PhD in applied microeconomics. And the last time I took a macroeconomics course was second year undergraduate. So my current macroeconomics understanding is it's the same as everybody else in the Bitcoin space. It's listening to Lynn Alden, it's listening to James Lavish, it's listening to all the really good people that we have on macro in the space. One story that's kind of telling is back during COVID, being a microeconomist and having like been in the markets for a long time, I watched the COVID crash, and then the markets did a big bounce. And I thought, oh, for sure, this is going to like it's going to bounce up. It's sort of the dead cat bounce, and like the markets will bounce, and then they'll fall back down to prior lows again. So I went out and shorted like crazy on the Dow and Nasdaq indexes, and of course the very like in within 2 days, the Fed had announced that they were pumping money into the system, and at that time, not being a macroeconomist, I didn't realize what the significance of the magnitude of what they were looking at pumping into the monetary system was. And yeah, so my shorts didn't go well there.
So, do you continue to invest in the stock market and in things like MicroStrategy?
I put just a tiny bit of money into MicroStrategy. It's the only stock that I have now. And yeah, we'll see what happens with that. Yeah, I don't fully like I watch the podcasts on MicroStrategy, and I understand that they're trying to build new financial products with different risk levels for different types of investors, and that there's bonds and preferred shares and all sorts of different offerings. I'm more of a pure Bitcoin person, I think. Why do that? Like just buy Bitcoin. It's like it's easy. But I did dabble with it a bit because here in Canada we have retirement accounts that we have Bitcoin ETFs. I've had money in my retirement account in Bitcoin ETFs for since they were like available, and I took a little bit and tried just a little tiny bit of MicroStrategy in there as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And for those of us with retirement accounts that cannot be in self custody Bitcoin, MicroStrategy and the ETFs are an option for now, because
Mhm.
otherwise you'd have to take a big tax hit, and if it's even allowed.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it was convenient. And Canada was, I think, 4 years ahead of the US on the ETF side. So we had a head start.
Well, go Canada.
I know.
So, I read in one of your blogs you had a definition of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a decentralized open source digital ledger that enables global peer to peer financial transactions. And I thought that was great. Jeff Booth's definition is Bitcoin is an open, decentralized, secure protocol bounded by energy. So I thought kind of combining those two would make a really good one, because he doesn't say anything about peer to peer, and I don't think you said anything about energy.
No, and I must say that that was not original. Like, I don't know where that came from. It was probably a hodgepodge of different definitions that I looked at. But the energy part is certainly crucial. Is defined. It's Bitcoin is defined in energy use, and that's a central piece to it. It just makes that immutability a feature of Bitcoin that you can't have if you are looking at other ways, such as proof of stake or different types of ways of creating other cryptos or altcoins.
And that is one of your focus is on energy and about methane emissions and how Bitcoin mining can help mitigate these emissions and
Mhm.
provide incentives for renewable energy projects.
Yeah. Yeah, that has been a main focus. That's been part of my work with Satoshi Action. We've had a large mining focus. So that's Dennis Porter, and his original vision for Satoshi Action was really to support proof of work. It's actually, yeah, the focus of Satoshi Action. If you actually look in the mission, it's about education, policy advocacy, research relating to proof of work, and part of what we had done, we've done a few different types of energy oriented academic papers and working papers or preprints. We've looked at grid balancing and sort of the general energy situation. And then we looked very, very specifically at methane emission from landfills. And developed a model of what your break even costs would be at a landfill, typical small American landfill, to produce methane on site, to go in, invest, put in the generators that are necessary, the Bitcoin miners, and then looked at what the outputs would be from that, to come up with an idea of how much existing landfills could expect to recover their costs by mining Bitcoin. And we did that. That was in conjunction with the people from Nodal Energy, and they have landfill sites in that are running Bitcoin mines in Utah, New Mexico right now. They're affiliated with Marathon, and yeah, so it was a first model. We're talking to people shortly. We had a call last week with some people from Alaska. So there's some interest in Alaska with methane mining, methane based Bitcoin mining in Alaska. There's also some interest in other areas as well. And the beauty about that is methane's a very, very potent greenhouse gas. And so for anyone that wants to see carbon equivalent emissions come down into the atmosphere, methane is an absolutely critical thing to control. And methane's very difficult to control because we have emissions from agriculture, from food processing, there's from coal mines, there are also landfills, any sorts of waste management. And there's also natural methane emissions that come out of lakes and up north. So there's many different sources, and no one solution is going to fit all of them. But mining is something that potentially has impacts on landfills, also sewage treatment plants, food processing plants internationally, and think like sugarcane in the tropics, the amount of biomass that just emits methane down there. So methane's a very important gas to control. Plus, it's basically free energy. It works out by the time you invest in the mechanical equipment at a scale that's like not too large. You're probably looking maybe 4.5 cent production cost for your electricity, 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour for your electricity. And that's something that's very competitive in the Bitcoin mining space. And I think the potential is for larger facilities that are capturing methane, say a large landfill, and generating efficiently, capturing some economies of scale. You could probably produce electricity down towards the 2.5 to 3 cent per kilowatt hour, maybe even lower than that. I've heard numbers. And we also have traditional agriculture as well. So there's farms in Ireland right now that are using digesting biodigesters for manure that are then being used to power Bitcoin mines. So there's a ton of opportunity, and it helps clean up the environment. It helps distribute mining globally potentially, and it helps with cost recovery. Like none of these small mines or the landfills, they aren't going to be commercially viable Bitcoin miners, but usually the funding for landfills comes from municipal or regional taxpayers. So any money saved there ultimately gets passed back to consumers and citizens through lower taxes if it was really successful.
And is it also profitable for these cities and counties to do that? And can private people do it also?
Well, private people can do it. It's probably and there's a so besides the technicalities of the Bitcoin mining from landfill gas, which we covered in the model, there's also the question of business arrangements. And so how are business arrangements structured so that landfills can get some sort of a cost recovery on their landfill operations? So what happened in the case of the Utah, New Mexico mines? A lot of times the Bitcoin miners that are interested in going in will go in and say, okay, we'll pay for the infrastructure that's needed to say you have a landfill that's currently venting methane into the atmosphere. A Bitcoin miner would go in and they would pay for the using that methane. They'd get the generators. They'd have the cleanup equipment that was needed to basically scrub and take contaminants out of the gas. And then they would put in the electrical generators that would then feed into the Bitcoin mining containers that were on site. And so that's the process. So it's difficult to talk about, is it profitable or not? Obviously, some people think it's profitable enough to be putting miners in on a commercial basis. Myself, I think it's almost like we could have a role for like nonprofit, like a nonprofit Bitcoin mining organization to help with the cost recovery, where they went in and maybe weren't looking to be commercially profitable, but they were just looking to help out municipal and city landfills that would reduce their tax burden locally. And internationally, then it's a whole other thing because you look in Africa and the amount of urban landfills that there are that are untreated right now. There's potential there for some probably commercially viable, commercially profitable Bitcoin mines.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Another area that I hadn't heard about.
Yeah,
Tell
it's
us.
fascinating opportunities. And that's not even getting into the methane flaring and the waste gas off of oil wells and abandoned oil wells. There's a lot of potential.
Yeah, so I have heard about that. I've heard about the flaring
Mhm.
from people like Lisa Huff and some of the mining people. But yeah, it's very interesting to use landfills. And it's just another example of how Bitcoin makes us want to do better for the world. And like you said, maybe some people will just want to improve the environment.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's crazy, and one of the things, like having been in environmental economics and policy myself in academia, seeing the just abysmal quality of the early research work that came out, that was really negative on Bitcoin mining. It's not necessary just because a person's in academia and in the environmental field should not or does not mean that they're automatically anti-Bitcoin, which is the impression within the entire Bitcoin space, I think. I mean, I mentioned earlier back in 2015 on one of the Horizon scans, coin mining was picked up as its capacity to to absorb waste energy, um, or waste gas, was flagged early in the space, but none of the subsequent papers, like the Alex DeVries papers, and there's a few other authors that are particularly negative, but those people just ignored the evidence that was already out there.
Hmm. So you create some amazing briefing notes of
Thank you.
Bitcoin podcasts, and which are basically summaries of the podcasts for people maybe who don't have enough time to listen or want a quick summary. Tell us a little bit about why you decided to start doing that and which podcasts you have learned a lot from.
Yeah. How much do you want to go into this? So one of my academic specialties was horizon scanning. So we used to do workshops. We would go out to an academic community and a policy community and solicit candidate research questions, and then we'd convene a workshop with maybe 30 and go through and try to work through what the most important questions were. And then we take those out and publish them. And those were a way to get people talking about research agendas in particular fields and to organize and to figure out for research donors where the most attractive opportunities might be. So being in the Bitcoin space after I left academia, and with a horizon scanning background, and with AI, when AI came out and really became functional with GPT 3.5, I thought, oh, it'd be really amazing to be able to uh, go through what's happening in the Bitcoin space and to harvest candidate research questions. And so I did that for 2023 and 2024. I think I've gone through, I think it's about 4,000 podcasts, and so I have a prompts, AI prompts that I use that have evolved over the past 2.5 years, and I go in and scrape these YouTube transcripts, and I harvest candidate research questions and try to prioritize them. Well, from there, it's only one simple step, really, to go and start to communicate what those podcasts have been about. So I didn't do it for all of them. Last summer, I started doing briefing notes, but then I didn't publicize it. I put it up on my own blog post, but basically they were for my own use. Um, and then I think it was about 2 months ago, I started actually publicizing them a bit and letting other people have access. And part of the reason I did it then was because AI is getting so good that it's my level of confidence that AI is able to accurately communicate the key concepts from transcriptions, from complex transcriptions, is high enough now that I'm like 99% sure it captures the main points. And so I thought, okay, it's probably time to start sharing those. And just for the point of from the perspective of being able to have people get that access rather than having to listen to a 60 or 90-minute podcast, maybe they can go and do a 5 to 10 minute read. The links are all for all the podcasts are in the blog posts. And so then if they see something they like, they can go and actually listen to the whole thing or skim the whole thing. So that's where it came from. And And then when you ask, well, what are the most valuable ones or the ones that I like? And it's like, wow, that's quite a question because there's just so much material. I think I've summarized last 2024 podcasts. I think I covered 80, if I remember the correct number, it's about 84 different broadcasts and there was 1,800 hours of transcriptions. So it's just like I like I like some of the macro because I'm learning about macro. It's something I don't have training in, as I mentioned. So Lynn Alden, I used to like the Greg Foss pods when he was active in the space. There's certain shows that are very, very thoughtful, I find, and they go into depth. I do only pretty well only long form podcasts. I don't do the banter shows really. I don't summarize anything shorter than 30 minutes usually. I also like there's some non-Bitcoin podcasts that occasionally summarize. So some of the ARK Invest technology advancements. I do occasional AI summaries. One of the pods I've just come across a little while ago was Jordy Visser's macro work, and so I really like his podcast because it like breaks down what's been going on for the week in the macro world in a very, very, I find, logical way. Uh, yeah, yeah, there's a lot out there. It's also very interesting to see that there's been all sorts of new podcasts that have come to light the last while. Now, yours has been, how long have you been going now with your pod?
I'm almost up to a year, probably 9
Yeah.
months.
Yeah, and see, it had never come up on my searches before. So I have RSS feeds for I follow right now about 85 different pods. So I have RSS feeds. So whenever there's a new pod, it comes in. But what I've been finding the last while is up on my YouTube page, there's something in the algorithm that's changed. So I'm starting to see these pods that I'd never even encountered. And I actively searched for Bitcoin pods all the time. And so nothing against, your podcast particularly, but for some reason it wasn't coming up in the algorithms. And then we've had a whole bunch of new pods that have just come up, which is really interesting as well. The newer pods tend to focus more on content, and some of the old ones are getting like really, really bad about like shilling stuff. Like there's some of the podcasts are just so laden with promotions and embedded into the actual interviews that I keep on having to tell my AI prompt. I said you got to be really careful with this pod because they tend to embed product promotions into the text itself. So I think I've got them mainly covered. I understand too for people that are looking to make a living or income out of social media posting that when you're on the YouTube and X that you need to sort of play along with the game and satisfy the algorithms.
Yeah, there is a lot to it. And I certainly don't understand the algorithm. But as a new pod, you tend not to be shown until you start getting popular.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
And I have the same thing with my blog. I mean, I need to double up basically my views on my blog to get to a stage where I could monetize. So right now, because I work for Satoshi Action, I'm technically on like a part-time basis. So I have income coming in. Plus, I sort of retired, and so it's like this is a retirement project for me anyway. And so I don't have sponsors for the blog and I don't run ads on the blog right now. And I might run ads at some time just because I think as offensive as I find them on a blog, I think it's a transparent and like people understand that, okay, there's ads there. You just scroll through them and that's that.
what are some of the other lessons from Bitcoin specifically that you have learned over the years? You mentioned low time preference.
Yep.
Has that changed since you got into Bitcoin?
For myself,
Yes.
I don't think so, but time preference is something. This goes back to environmental policy. I'm really, really interested academically in time preferences because what it implies for investment. And I know a lot of people watching this are probably going, on climate science and climate change, it's just all a scam. But, the science is like super strong behind it, barring some pods having like fourth year undergrads criticizing climate science. Um, so I have no problems at all with the climate science side of it, but being a policy analyst in the I taught climate policy for years. And this is a circle, but it all relates to time preferences. And one of the things, if you have high time preferences, so actually, let me step back. In the climate policy world, you have two sort of major pathways to taking care of climate change. You can either mitigate, you can do something now that prevents carbon from going into the atmosphere, and that will prevent problems down the road. So you invest now, but your benefits for that investment don't come into the distant future. And if you have high time preferences, it makes zero sense to do that, because you're taking money that you could have spent in education or health or infrastructure development, anything else, and you're spending that in climate mitigation that you don't know is going to work. And when it does work, it's not like, from a from a time preference perspective, it's going to have a very low present value. So there's that side of the policy debate. And if you have high time preferences, you also encourage short-term spending. And so, you have this consumerist society and you're not thinking about the future and investing in things for your family and for your businesses that have these long-term impacts. So it's really interesting. And this has been rarely covered in the environmental and academic world, is that how important Bitcoin's changing impact on time preferences could be for things like dealing with climate change, and for effectively dealing with climate change by making investments that at a time and in a manner which makes sense. And so right now we have quite often my colleagues in academia, which tended to be pretty left leaning, would say, oh no, we have to pour as much money into climate change mitigation right now, immediately as possible to prevent disaster down the line. And that's correct. If we hit some sort of climate tipping point, we go over and we can't get back. But then the flip side, then, you had the more fiscally conservative people who were saying, no, we can invest in things that we know improve our society, and education and health and all these other things now, and then we can adapt to climate change later on. Well, it turns out that if you want to adapt, one of the biggest factors for successful adaptive capacity is your ability to preserve wealth over time. And lo and behold, besides Bitcoin influencing time preferences, coin as a long-term store of value also impacts the viability of adaptive capacity. It builds adaptive capacity for households, for cities, for countries over time. So you have this dual pathway that Bitcoin impacts environmental policy, and that's just a complete black hole for academics right now.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. And especially, I haven't talked about this, but just since you know about it, it seems like a lot of the critics of the environment say that it's just the natural cycle. And, with the politics at the moment, and I don't talk politics on this show, but it seems like we're happy with the fiscal way things are going, but sometimes then the environmental and climate change is pushed aside. And I just wonder about it because I watch a lot of programs on the North Pole and the ice melting, and scientists say it's happening. So we care about the earth, but then you got this other side that says no, it's not even happening.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm one of my sidelines is I'm a part-time pro photographer. Well, COVID killed my business, but I have run tours to different places. I had tours that were scheduled for grizzly bear photography. So we go out and sit in a riverside with grizzly bears wandering around up in the northern Yukon. And that has been completely disrupted because it's been so warm up there. So the grizzly bear population had evolved there was a very late run of chum salmon that came up the Yukon River, way up the river into this area where there was warm springs percolating up through the gravel. Very, very unique situation. And then the grizzly bears would come in the winter, and there was these caves up above the river that they'd come in and they just gorged themselves on salmon, and then waddle up the hill and sleep it off for the rest of the winter. The northern Yukon and the Canadian Arctic is getting so warm right now that the natural patterns that have evolved over millennia aren't holding. So my tours the last 2 years are being canceled because there hasn't been enough bears in the area. The warm water has in the rivers and the out in the Gulf of Alaska have changed the migration patterns for the salmon. So the salmon haven't been able to make it back up the river. So the grizzly bears have had to go out and forage on berries instead of eating salmon before they go to sleep. So that's just like one quick example, but you see these examples all over the place. And the people will say, oh, well, we have cold weather, we have warm weather, but it's just, that's just the way it goes. But we see in the geological records that we're accelerating our climate, our temperature. We're basically following the same pattern as all of our technologies so far. We have this like pattern that goes along, it bounces up and down, and then boom, it goes like off the scale as it goes up. So yeah, I have like no argument with the climate science. I just don't see how anybody can, but I completely understand how we can look at completely different policy prescriptions for the problem.
And you believe that by having a sound money like Bitcoin, that is going to improve the way we deal with climate problems and other.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important. And this is something that, as I learn more about the macro scene, that it's becoming more evident. Even before, like I was kind of the adaptive capacity and the mitigation, sort of the financial viability of long-term investments for mitigation, those were, to me, they were fairly obvious like 10 years ago. And I hadn't put together those with the sound money. That was something I was not familiar with at that time. When we look at money printing, currency debasement, inflation that happens, the political instability that comes with that, the bifurcation in wealth within societies, all these things that relate back to money are the drivers of our environmental problems that we have. And it's not just climate change, it's contaminants in the environment. It's like, I'm a fisheries person by background. So it's like fishery problems, all these different environmental problems that have been manifested over the past four or 5 decades are all coming at the same time that the money system changed. So I don't think there's any appreciation within academia right now and little within government about how important getting the money equation correct is to naturally, well, naturally might be a bit strong, but to bring about some corrective actions and corrective policies that will actually help out our natural world.
Yeah. And that is because everything is downstream of money.
Yeah.
And for people to realize that is quite a big leap. What I'm hearing you say is that because we don't have sound money, people are just trying to get by and survive inflation. I mean, we just want to survive and make as much money as we can. And same with governments. They're profiting most being at the top. And it's a very hard place to divorce yourself from. So that's part of the reason why we're in the system that promotes this short-term thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And the short-term thinking is, you know people, I know people, everybody that listens to this will know people that they don't have any time to think about anything. I mean, think what happens right now if you have like a sort of a normal family wage. Well, first of all, two people are working and you have kids that are in school and there might be daycare costs and everybody's busy. Everybody's like super busy. I have a daughter who's 41 right now and 4 grandkids, and like their life is just like it blows me up just thinking about it. How how financially stressed they are, how time stressed they are, and that's the nature. That's like you said, the finance money is upstream to that. That's what driving a lot of this. Things change as generations change, and I could sit around and say, well, back in the old days, didn't have this or didn't do that, but things are just evolving in our society, and that evolution in society is largely driven by the form of money that we have and the form of banking that we have and the way that governments have used that. And so I think there's, for me being traditionally like sort of from the left end of the spectrum, climate science believing, Bitcoin, 100% Bitcoin person, but I'm really, really unlike, your typical Bitcoin maxi maybe because a lot of my political views and my personal views are on the other side of the spectrum. but like we're like dead aligned on the role of money being the fundamental driver of the problems of society, the need for long-term time horizons for planning, and the impacts of money on both the well-being of our natural capital, the environment, and on our human capital and our more than that, our communities and our families.
Yeah, all very important. And is your daughter and her family, do they know about Bitcoin?
They know about Bitcoin, but they also have relatives on the other side of the family that are total like degens and like into altcoins. Uh, but they have no money, like they have no spare cash that they could invest even if they wanted to. But they should be okay eventually.
Yep, same with my family. They think it's a good idea, but they don't have any spare cash,
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
they're
So
not making the spare cash for it.
they're not. Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, my daughter and her husband and four kids. They live in Vancouver. Like Vancouver is one of the most expensive cities in the world, and it's just like, it's just insane, like how much they have to like sort of scrimp and cut corners to even survive. And I go to local Bitcoin meetups. So I haven't been to any of the Vancouver ones, but I've been up to Whistler, and down in Victoria to a number. And I've been really struck by, the 30 and 40-year-olds, like just how difficult things are financially for them right now. And like home ownership in this area, I don't know what it's like in Miami, but here, even on Vancouver Island, you're looking, well, a million plus Canadian. So about $700,000 for just a basic little house.
Yep, same in Miami, and it seems to be that way around the world. Spoke to Peter Dunworth, he said the same in Sydney, and it's very difficult for people on their salaries today to afford a house in
Yeah.
the median price range.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I went out to rental only back in 2021.
You went back to rental? Yeah. I own a small place, but I sold my investment property for Bitcoin because it just didn't make sense anymore.
Early part of the curve.
I hope so. Tell us a little bit about your approach to Bitcoin price modeling.
Well, like I said, I'm a micro economist, so I use supply and demand modeling. I used fixed supply in if for anyone's familiar, like economic 100 supply and demand charts, fixed supply is a vertical supply curve. There's no price responsiveness because there's only so many Bitcoin around. And so what happens in a Bitcoin supply curve, if you can picture a supply demand chart, your supply curve is vertical and it just slowly marches back towards zero as Bitcoin is taken out of circulation. And the demand curve then is downward sloping like a normal demand curve, and it presumably is increasing as we get more and more retail, institutional, and government adoption. And when you get reducing supply and increasing demand, that sets up for like really big price increases. So I did the first modeling exercise that I did. We published that in a journal publication. So in price forecasts, like they're out in the public realm. I mean, $1 to $3 million per Bitcoin is sort of what supply demand models suggest at a minimum. And there's no reason it can't go up way up from there.
By when?
And I was just going to say, but the caveat is the timing. So we don't know supply shock. I'm sort of like on team Samson and Adam back for there's going to be like un, there will be a supply shock at some time that we have never seen before. And that's just the nature of Bitcoin, the fixed supply, but when that will be is uncertain. And in the modeling paper, I worked with an assumption that we had about 11 million circulating supply. Now I saw an X a couple of days ago. Somebody was saying, no, it's only 3 million, and I find that really hard to believe. So the question is, how fast will supply actually get drained from the system? So will MicroStrategy actually be able to keep all their Bitcoin, or at some time will they be forced to sell some? The ETF holders, we've seen like a lot of money that was brought into ETFs that was then sold off. So there's a lot of hedge fund activity and different strategies, different derivative strategies going on in the ETF space. So that's not necessarily Bitcoin that's coming permanently out of circulation. We know that there's nations mining, state reserves are a possibility. There's all this different stuff going on, but we aren't sure like how much of that will come into back into circulation. So I would have said if everything was coming out of circulation, I would have said we would be about 2 to 3 years from a price shock. I think the more I think about the modeling, and I'm actually trying to revise the modeling right now to account for Bitcoin going out of circulation, coming back in. And my guess is that it might be more like 4 or 5 years, but it totally depends on nation state adoption, I think is the main thing right now that's the driver. If we get strong nation state adoption, that's going to push it forward. And maybe we'll have some preliminary supply shocks that sort of pump up the price, and then we get a drop back down after that frees up. Maybe, I seem to hear a lot about people that, well, maybe once Bitcoin hits 500,000 US or $1 million US, that they'll sell some. So I sort of suspect that we'll see quite a bit of leakage back into the system once we start to get up to those like round numbers. So I don't know what the timing is. I have no idea. I would suspect I would be really surprised if we went 10 years and there wasn't like a huge supply shock. And I would say maybe as soon as 2 or 3. I don't think it's going to happen this cycle if we still have cycles. I think there's going to be enough Bitcoin coming into the OTC desks and from some of the OGs and coming back out of ETFs, sort of buffer things for a while. But at some time, it's inevitable.
So slowly, then suddenly.
Slowly, then suddenly, and we don't know when the suddenly is. And like, that's why I can't, I would never trade Bitcoin. Like, I used to trade like options all the time, but I wouldn't take the chance now of selling any, trying to buy it back, because that suddenly, when it happens, it's going to be suddenly, and it won't be when people expect. And it will, it will be easy to have your Bitcoin, have to buy it back at half the price than it was before.
And do you also take into account
Double the
the
price.
lost? Oh, okay. Do you also take into account the lost Bitcoin?
Yeah, and the way that I did the modeling paper is I tried to keep it as flexible as possible. So I make assumptions in the paper, but then I vary those assumptions around. And like, there's certainly the 1 to 1.1 million Satoshi coins that we can pretty safely assume are gone. There's probably, I think in the paper, I think if I remember correctly off the top of my head, I think I used 3.5 million lost coins. So, and then we have roughly 1 million coins yet to be mined. So that's 5 million. So that's, we're still only at 16 million. Maybe another 3, 4 million of those are really, truly permanently hodled. That's a question mark. So to me, it just says that unless there's a lot more lost coins out there, I think we're still quite a ways from the final supply shock.
Yeah. Like you said, that will be nation adoption, possibly, and a lot more people coming into the Bitcoin space.
More people, yeah, more companies. I haven't seen good numbers on what, full corporate treasury adoption would be. I mean, that would be a lot of coins. If it goes, say it was over 5 years, like 50% of the corporations start to hold a Bitcoin reserve. I mean, that would add a huge amount of demand. So there's all these factors that could add a lot of demand, and some of them could do it very, very quickly. And that's where the uncertainty is in this.
Do you also hold coins in self-storage, or you
Yeah.
only in ETFs?
No, everything. The only reason I have ETFs is because it was retirement. It was a retirement fund that I had for equities, and I just switched to Bitcoin. So I'd have to pay taxes on that, taking it out now. No, whatever I've managed to accumulate, it's all offline, cold storage, paranoid about my security.
Yeah. Well, you started out by saying that you weren't a Maxi, but your practices and your knowledge are like a Maxi. You're just not a toxic Maxi.
Well, it's not even, I mean, I think there's a role for toxic maxis actually, but I'm not a maxi I'm a vegetarian. Uh, that's right, rules me out as a maxi right there, I think, in the Bitcoin space. I'm not an Austrian economist. I don't like Austrian economics. I just think I'm very quantitative in focus, being a microeconomist. I mean, there's some interesting crossovers. I'm an institutional economist, if anybody is wondering. So there's some interesting crossovers between Austrian and institutional, but I like quantitative economics, and Austrian doesn't have it. And as an institutional economist, I'm very interested in transaction costs and how Bitcoin as a new technology can reduce transaction costs and what the effects in the world are. So there's quantitative research. There's a whole bunch of quantitative research that is yet to be done. And back to the questions that you were asking about earlier, I'm actually working on a book right now for the 2024 interviews, trying to flesh out a possible research agenda for 100 of the top questions in the Bitcoin space. In the Bitcoin space, those were all extracted from Bitcoin-oriented podcasts. So I think that there's a lot of quantitative work on the adoption side that needs to be done. What are the determinants of adoption? What are the pathways to adoption? There's all these questions, and I'm, focused on transaction costs and institutions and microeconomics. So I'm definitely not an Austrian economist. I'll offend some more people there. What else do I do that's environmental field generally? I guess that would get me too. So there's a lot of things that I'm very much all Bitcoin on, but I'm very much not the normal sort of stereotype or the normal type of maxi that people think of when they think of maxis.
But you're not a Keynesian economics.
No, no, and again, this comes to the whole micro macro business. I don't know anything, any of the I probably know more details now about Austrian economics than I do about Keynesian. I just think so many people in the applied microeconomics, so it's environmental, energy, health, transportation. There's a couple of other fields too, but we're all very much focused on the same sort of empirical tools that we use across these fields. And a lot of people in my space just think that macroeconomics is voodoo, whichever way you cut it.
Well, maybe it is.
Maybe it is, and and that's being a touch facetious, but there are things that, yeah, there are things that going on. I just never got into the Keynesian Austrian debate. Yeah, macro policy, it just seems so arbitrary all the time. It's just yeah, how many economists are there working at the Fed, and they still change their mind all the time, and they disagree with each other all the time.
Well, they might not be the best ones to listen to. I think some of the Bitcoin macro economists are actually better.
Okay.
And as far as liquidity goes, there is something to it because
Yeah.
definitely risk assets and Bitcoin tend to increase when liquidity increases.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm definitely coming to appreciate that part of macroeconomics more. And I would love to be able to eventually with the supply demand model, which is a micro model, I would love to be able to then incorporate a liquidity supply as a driver into the demand side on the micro model. I think that's the best way to come at it is you have piecemeal, you do M2 money supply, and then maybe there's some other factors that come into it, and you plug those macro oriented models. You're not trying to directly model Bitcoin price on a macro basis, but you're using the macro drivers to model Bitcoin demand. And I think that's totally legitimate. Then you feed in the demand into the supply demand framework to see what Bitcoin price does over time. But you need to understand what the drivers are behind it.
So I know you're scientifically based, but do you think there is a spiritual connection with Bitcoin?
Depends what you mean by spiritual. I'm Buddhist by inclination, Buddhist atheist. There's another thing that's another problem point for the traditional maxis. Within science, there's a really interesting debates going on in the consciousness field right now. I met Stuart Hammerhoff at a conference, must have been 10, 12 years ago. We talked quite a bit about his work with Sir Roger Penrose and what would be called typically panpsychism. But Roger Penrose, I think, has got it nailed. Roger Penrose is of the opinion that consciousness goes all the way down. So I wouldn't say spiritual. I was raised in a Baptist family, so it was I just sort of I need to be careful of getting too close to that. But I think that consciousness is something that humans have evolved. There's another one for the maxis to go after. I'm an evolutionist as well. I think that human consciousness and consciousness generally in sentient animals and even possibly in plants, well, probably in plants, has evolved to take to be able to tap into this base layer of consciousness. So actually, absolutely, from if you call spiritual as a base layer of consciousness, I view myself as a sensor. Like I'm the sensor that wanders around the world picking things up, and so is my dog, and so is everybody else. And we make the mistake of thinking somehow that we're super independent from everybody else, but actually, it's me and my dog who's sleeping down there under my feet. We're sensing things, but this is my Buddhist side, is that we wrongly perceive that we're separate entities, and we're actually the subject and the object are not the things that that give us that consciousness. It's the connection, the flow of consciousness between everything. That's a really convoluted, quick way to say it, but
Yeah, I like that. And I like talking to different people because Bitcoin is for everybody. It's not just for one religion or one type of person, it's for everybody. And I do believe, the person I follow the most is Jeff Booth, and he says we are all connected.
mhm.
I too believe we are all connected. I've read many books on trees and how their roots, they all communicate with each other. You can believe that or not, but we are connected. And the reason I ask the spiritual question is not that Bitcoin is a religion, but that Bitcoin guides us to maybe care more about our fellow human beings. And that in itself might be spiritual.
Yeah, absolutely. And within Buddhism, certainly the fundamental tenet is that the consciousness that's picked up by our perceptions is something that is fundamentally compassionate, and that's the natural state of things. Now, it'd be interesting with Jeff Booth. I mean, his firm is Ego Death, which is largely a Buddhist term. So I've never quite been. I don't know if he's actually sort of has a Buddhist background at all or not, but from his demeanor and from what he says, I suspect he probably has encountered it before, but I'm not sure about that.
Well, you're the second person to say that. So I just need one more and then we're confirmed. I'm actually talking to Jeff Booth next week. So I will ask him, but he tends not to answer those questions.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit out there, and a lot of people have a lot of different beliefs about things, and it's difficult to ground them. And especially, I come from academics. I'm another sort of division between myself and maybe the traditional Maxis. I'm very much a school of pragmatism. Truth is what is useful for us, and like that will just send horror waves. I know through some of the first principles people. And I'm completely evolutionist, pragmatist. That truth evolves, and people can be really uncomfortable talking about personal truth just because everybody's different. Everybody has different backgrounds. They have different beliefs. And everything's fine in given what circumstances you come from. But some people aren't comfortable talking about that.
Yeah. And our focus is Bitcoin. I just enjoy having different people on because maybe there are other people who have your beliefs and will also relate. I agree with a lot of what you said. I have beliefs from both sides and I don't need to pigeonhole myself in any side.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like a lot of the academic writing that I've done so far has been very much it's oriented. It's really education or awareness building for academics. And I did one article on sort of a short piece on pragmatist philosophy and Bitcoin, how Bitcoin is full of surprises. And for anybody traditionally from the left, from academia, which left and academia generally go together, but if you start to look at Bitcoin, that there's all these things with energy conservation, with human rights. There's all these components that traditionally, with deliberative democracy, that concern people that have traditionally been on the left. And so a lot of the reasons that I do the academic writing is just as awareness building that, no, you can have these beliefs and these views. That are far outside what people believe is the typical Bitcoiner by watching Bitcoin YouTubers. And it's a big, big home. And you hear some people in the Bitcoin space talking about it. Bitcoin's for everyone, but that's not the message sometimes that comes through when you watch YouTube. And I certainly see it summarizing like last year's 1,800 YouTube videos. There are some opinions that are not very tolerant, which is unfortunate because I think it should be as all inclusive, the big tent for everybody.
Well, When you look at the big picture, we are all one. What I believe, what I do to somebody else, I'm also doing to myself. So that's not my intention, but I also don't want to argue with people on the show.
Mhm.
Yeah, but so I want to have all different types of people. And I really appreciate you coming on today. Has Bitcoin changed you?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It has. It's not. I think there are things that I have been interested in and aware of, and Bitcoin has helped explain why my interest was there. And particularly with regard to what we said about time preferences. And time preferences change. I'm 66 years old now, and it's like, so your your view on time preferences and they sort of shift over lifetimes. And but how time preferences have the potential to impact the world, how Bitcoin has the capacity to really fight authoritarianism, uh, and to promote liberty. Now, that's not something you would typically find from somebody maybe saying on the sort of the leftist side of the political spectrum. But, going back when I was in university undergrad, I mean, I was completely left wing anarchist. It's like I read every anarchist book on both sides of the political spectrum, but I was very much on the mutual cooperation side of the equation, sort of the left leaning libertarian, and was always somewhat kind of disappointed that the right wingers had sort of co-opted the term. So whenever you think of libertarian now, you tend to think of it as right wing, but there's an entire left wing history there as well. Yeah. So there's these things that have been percolating all the way since I was back in like my, 20 years old, that Bitcoin has helped to explain. And I think that's the real eye opener for me now. And plus, I'm still learning like crazy, even though like I'm 3 years in the space. There's just so much going on, and so much to try to I try to keep pace with what's going on. Obviously can't altogether, but I don't know anything yet about the technical space. So I've had my sort of my basic training in macro from the Bitcoin YouTube space and some of the people in it, and I tried to get through some of the technical things. But I mean, there's so much going on in the technical side as well that really feel that I need to improve my understanding there. I do run a node. I don't do any home mining just because it overheats the house.
Yeah, that's great. Running a node. Yeah, I love that. We're always learning in Bitcoin. And like I said, I really appreciate you being here today. I will put links to your X and your website.
Awesome. Thanks very much for having me, Paula.